So we're dealing with one of the most fundamental sugyas in Hilchos Shabbos. Fascinating sugya and a very well-known machlokes between Gedolei HaRishonim. Pshat in the Gemara, Kuf Gimel Amud Aleph, Ovid Ba'ared Dechavrei. So I assume I don't need to teach you Pshat. You probably delve into the amkas of the sugya. I just want to share with you my mahalach in Psikreisha de Lanichalei, Bebiur Machlokes Achinuch V'Hatoises. So most of the Rishonim disagree with the Sefer Achinuch, not the Chinuch, the Oruch. Most of the Rishonim disagree with the Oruch, but the shit of the Oruch is Psikreisha de Lanichalei is mutar, goes back to the fundamental concept of davar she'einoi mischaven. To understand psikreisha de lo nichalei, we need to understand the concept of psikreisha. But we can't understand the concept of psikreisha until we understand the concept of davar she'einoi mischaven. What is the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon? Davar she'einoi mischaven mutar, kishitas Reb Shimon, or davar she'einoi mischaven chayiv, kishitas Reb Yehuda. So our last year was about Maleches Machsheves. And in the Shira Maleches Machsheves, I brought shittas HaTosfos that davar she'einoi mischaven b'Shabbos, even according to Reb Yehuda, is not an Issa D'Oraisa because it's not Maleches Machsheves. But the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon is not about Hilchos Shabbos. It is a machlokes regarding all the law in Shabbat Torah. Zvochim Tzadik Aleph, we find this machlokes lagabe the Issa D'Oraisa kibui eish shal gabi hamizbeach, eish shal merocha. Shabbos Yud Aleph, we find the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon regarding the Issa Sirus. So the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon is not a machlokes in Hilchos Shabbos. They have a separate machlokes in Hilchos Shabbos, whether it's Maleches Machsheves or not. But the Yesodus of the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon refers to all the Isurim Shabbat Torah. Halacha Reb Shimon davar she'einoi mischaven mutar. But this is a very fundamental and fascinating question. Why is davar she'einoi mischaven mutar according to Reb Shimon? Such a yesodus like a machlokes nowhere in Shas Bavli or Yerushalmi do we find an explanation. Why is davar she'einoi mischaven mutar? And why don't Chazal care to share with us, to explain with us what's the heter of davar she'einoi mischaven? Not only is it found nowhere in Bavli or Yerushalmi, I dare to say none of the Rishonim explain why davar she'einoi mischaven is mutar. And many times I teach my Talmidim, this is an awesome question. So the machlokes of Yehuda v'Reb Shimon is found many times in Shas. How do we understand the fact that neither Bavli nor Yerushalmi nor any of the Rishonim don't care to teach us what is the shit of Reb Shimon? Why is davar she'einoi mischaven mutar? Rashi, 300 Bali Tosfos, the Ramban, the Rashba, Gedolei Talmideim, the Ritva, the Ran, the Rosh, all the Rishonim, nobody cares to explain to us why davar she'einoi mischaven is mutar. So whenever we have a question like this, the reasoning must be, Hoyo ze kol kach poshut be'einayim, didn't occur to them that this is something that needs to be explained. To them, it was so poshut. Do we need to teach you olive beans? But to us, it's not poshut at all. But that's the only explanation. Why wouldn't Rashi and Tosfos and all the others care to to open our eyes and to teach us and to explain what's the shit of Reb Shimon? Why is the Shimon Mutar? I have a very similar question regarding another machlokes, which is not a machlokes tenuim, but rather a machlokes amelon, but it is also such a fundamental sugya. And this sugya deals not with lavim, like Dov Hashem Eschaven, but rather with mitzvahs to say. The machlokes that we find, Rosh Hashanah Chov Chesed Beis, and many other sources in Shas. Mitzvah Sichas Kavod. What is the machlokes? Rava and Rav Zera. Halacha, Mitzvah Sichas Kavod. Kach nifsek b'sinas Sabach. I think at one of the Archikalas I gave a shir about Mitzvah Sichas Kavod, and I asked the same question. This machlokes is found in many sources, Bavli and Yerushalmi. Nowhere in Bavli, nowhere in Yerushalmi. None of the Rishonim explain why mitzvah srichas kavona. What is the machlokes? So my response and explanation to these fundamental questions is Gedolei Atanoim Reb Yehuda v'Reb Shimon lagabe Dov Hashem Eschaven, Gedolei Ameroyim Rav Zera v'Rava lagabe mitzvah srichas kavona. The machlokes is in the very nature and the very essence of Maseh HaAdam, the nature and essence of Maseh HaMitzvahs. And because in the eyes of the Rishonim, so Poshut, they didn't see a need or a reason to explain. So regarding Mitzvah Sichas Kavana, the machlokes says, what is the nature of mitzvahs? Is it enough to perform a mitzvah? To be Yotzi Yadei Chayva? Everybody agrees that the proper way to do a mitzvah is far beyond mitzvah sichas kavana. It needs to be lishma, l'shem shemayim, bilti l'shem levadai, without any pnias. But that is l'chatchila. What is the minimum that is required? A person should be Yotzi Yadei Chayva. Is it necessary that the person is aware that he's Makayim a mitzvah? So the machlokes mitzvah sichas kavod is not about exeris kosev. It's about the most fundamental interpretation of what is a mitzvah. Is it necessary that a person is aware that he has intention to be Makayim a mitzvah, to be Yotzi Yadei Chayva, or is that not required? The machlokes Rav Yehuda v'Reb Shimon is, what is the nature of Maseh HaAdam? Not mitzvahs or averis, but rather Maseh HaAdam. Moiser HaAdam min haBehema. What defines humankind? With what is a human being different, superior to all the other creatures in the animal kingdom? What is unique about man? It is his mind, his thoughts. Whatever a person does is saif masa b'machshava techilo. And therefore, when a person performs an act without intention to achieve a result, according to Reb Shimon, it is not defined as Maseh HaAdam. And this fundamental principle, obviously, in the eyes of the Rishonim, was so poshut that they saw no need to explain. Where do we first find this simple explanation? Dov Hashem Eschaven. Why is it mutar? HaRav, Teferes Yisrael, Perek Mem Aleph. So the Maharal was a Sofek Makubal Sofek philosopher. It's impossible to define the Maharal. He is unique, stands apart. The Maharal in his writings insists, I'm not a philosopher. I'm against philosophy. The Maharal insists he's a Kabbalah. But his language is not the language of the Kabbalah. It's the language of the philosophers. The concepts he presents are not the same concept as the Kabbalah. So the Maharal was unique. impossible clearly to define. He was one of the greatest giants in Machshavas Yisrael, in Jewish Kabbalah and philosophy. So the Maral and Teferes is all Perek. It's not a halachic discussion. But in the Torah of the Maral, everything comes together. Lamdas and halacha and philosophy and Kabbalah, everything comes together in a beautiful psifas. So the Maral and Teferes Asor Perek Memarav speaks about the nature of Masay Ha'odam. And the Maral says, Kol poyel mikri einoi poyel ha'odam. Something that is coincidental is not the nature of human acts or deeds. And that is why Dov Hashem is Chaven Mutar. So the Maral is Mavliya. He doesn't deal with the sugi of Dov Hashem is Chaven. He just brings it Kiveder Chagav when he defines the nature of human actions and deeds. Rabbi Yosef Engel was one of the phenomenal Gedolim in recent generations. We grew up with Rabbi Yosef Engel. My late father was a Gevaldige Chassid of Rabbi Yosef Engel. He went to sleep with Rabbi Yosef Engel. He got up with Rabbi Yosef Engel. And our earliest memories as children is a lot associated with Rabbi Yosef Engel. And he was truly a phenomenal sage. Ein doim alei kemat. So on one of his magnificent forums, in Asman Diuraisa, Klal Chov Dalet, he brings an unbelievable source. And this is unique. That is the signature of Rabbi Yosef Engel. So in Yevomis Tzadik Vav Omid Beis, the Gemara tells a story. It's an Agadah. And the Gemara tells a story about Chachmi Yisrael that was sitting in a Beis Knesses B'Tveria, and they were arguing about Zoham Alistarin, about a question of Tumah V'Tahara, Ad Shekoru Sefer Torah B'Chamoson. And out of their rage and Ritcha D'Oraisa, Koru Sefer Torah, the Torah Sefer Torah, and the Gemara says, Koru Sal Kedata. Is it possible that great Tanuim, Torah Sefer Torah, Eloheima, Ad Shenikra Sefer Torah B'Chamoson. They didn't tear a Sefer Torah. It happened that the Sefer Torah was torn. So what's the difference between Karu and Nikra? Rashi writes, Karu Sefer Torah B'Chamoson, Karu Mashma B'Chavana. Hayala aladas that the Tenuim tore a Sefer Torah with Chavana, Ela Ad Shenikra Sefer Torah. So the basic Engel points out that is the difference between Kavona and the Vashiyeh Mischaven. Karu mashme b'chavona. If they tore that Sefer Torah without intention, without Kavona, they didn't tear that Sefer Torah. Nikra, it transpired. So the Yosef Engel, I don't think he quotes the Maral, but this is an amazing source from a story from an Agadita of Deim Darfman Zainur of Yosef Engel. You know, to bring a source like this in a sugi of Dov Hashem Eschaven, you gotta be Rabbi Yosef Engel. To tie in a Rashi in a story told in Yevomis Tzadik Vav Omid Beis. Karu, Chazal say it's impossible. How would we even imagine that the Tenon Torah Sefer Torah? Karu mashma b'chavona, ela nikra Sefer Torah b'chamoson. And the great Chazon Ish. If anybody compares to the Yosef Engel, totally different style. But I'm a Gevaldige Chassid of the Chazon Ish. My Talmidim know many times. I say my base medish and my Koil, the Chazon Ish was a Rishon. He was thrown 500, 600 years out of his natural surroundings that our generation should see, how it should learn. So the Chazon Ish Orach Chaim Simenu and Ois Aleph writes, Dovar shenasa b'li chavona einoi maseh ha'odam. Whatever is done without intention cannot be defined as maseh ha'odam, because the nature of maseh odam is, as I quoted, Seif Ma'aseh b'machshava techila, and that is why Reb Shimon maintains Dovar she'einoi mischaven mutar. There is no yichus between the teitzot, between the maisa and the person. If he did something without intention, it is as if it happened. That's the Maral, that's the Yosef Engel, that's the Chazon Ish. And B'derech Menadrochim, that's Rashi. But Rashi is an Agadat. Do we have any source in the Rishonim? Yes, we do. Not a Masechet Shabbos. Not dealing directly with the sugi of Dovah She'emes Chaven. But I think the concept is found in a Rosh. A Rosh Masechet Chulin, Daf Lamed Aleph. Perik Beis Masechet Chulin Simen Ches. And I'm quoting the Lashon of the Rosh. So the Rosh doesn't deal with the sugi of Dovah She'emes Chaven, but rather with the question of Kavanah B'Shchita. And that's a machlokes whether a person that just dropped a knife and the knife happened to shecht an animal, is that shchitik shera? And the Rosh writes, "Aval am noflo saken miyodoi b'loi kavona. Have kamoi she'em hoisu monachas ala koire v'hipilosoi haruach. B'loi karinem v'zovachto. V'ochalto kiven shelo neschavan shum davar." So if a person dropped a knife without kavona, it is as if that knife was on a table, on a log, on a rock, and the wind blew the knife and it shechted. So the Rosh is not dealing about Dovah She'emes Chaven, but rather about Kavanah Shchita. But his words are eye-opening, and they're exactly the way the concept of Dovah She'emes Chaven is understood by the Chazon Ish, by the Yosef Engel, by the Maran and Teferes Yisrael Perek Mem Aleph. If a person had no intention of using that knife, then it is as if the wind blew that knife and it fell and it shechted. If the Torah says one needs to be zoiveach, without kavana, lo mikra koyach gavra. It is not defined as masa adam. That is what we find in Rosh. So these are the sources which I brought, not in Minchas Osher Shabbos Pei Daled, but rather in Minchas Osher Psochim Simen Lamed. There are two very important simonim in Minchas Osher Psochim, in which I discussed at great length, in depth, the concept of Dovah She'emes Chaven. So after we understand Dovah She'emes Chaven, why it's mutter, let us try to understand why Psik Reisha is different and why Psik Reisha is chayiv. Abaye v'rova da amri tervayu moidereb shemem de Psik Reisha v'layomes shechayiv. So why is Psik Reisha chayiv afalpi shu Dovah She'emes Chaven? Two different approaches, two different pshatim, two different drachim. One derech, in my opinion, would be to say, if it's a Psik Reisha, then it's not a Dovah She'emes Chaven. If it's a Psik Reisha, we assume he does have intention. But he says, I had no intention. Coming back to the sugya of Mitzvah Sichas Kavona, and in no way do I need to say that these two sugyas are associated one with the other. No. Don't mistakenly understand me that way. Mitzvah Sichas Kavona is a machlokes hameroim. Dovah She'emes Chaven is a machlokes tenoim. The only common denominator between these two sugyas that I mentioned before is that they're so fundamental that neither Chazal nor the Rishonim saw a need to explain. And just like the machlokes Dovah She'emes Chaven deals with the very essence of human actions, the machlokes Sichas Kavona deals with the very essence of mitzvahs. How do we define a mitzvah? But I do want to draw a certain comparison by Mitzvah Sichas Kavona, and that is a huge discussion which I only briefly mentioned. We have the concept of Kavona Keha, And I explained many times what the Chayodim is Machadish and the Mishnah Berurah quotes him in Simon Samach. But Mitzvah Sichas Kavanah, sometimes even the person isn't aware that he had Kavanah Mitzvah, but we say this is defined as Kavanah Mitzvah. Kavanah Mitzvah is Sibas Asiyas Adavorim. Why did you do this? So a person says a mitzvah latilas lulav, and he takes the lulav and he doesn't know him, and then he comes to ask the Rav, Mamish, when I said the bracha and it was makayim the mitzvah, I thought about the tiyul that I had yesterday. I wasn't makayim to be makayim the mitzvah, and the Rav will tell him, no. Be calm. If you weren't makayim Hashem mitzvah, there would be no reason that you would pick up this lulav. That is defined as kavanah mitzvah. And the Chazon Ish defines it as kavanah keiho. It is almost in the level of the subconscious. You thought about different things, but in a very fundamental way, you were mechavan l'shem mitzvah, because otherwise there would be no reason to do nanuim. So when it's a psik reisha, we assume that, bearing in mind the person knows that this is the outcome, probably he did have kavona, even though he thinks it's a davar she'ein eschaven. That would be one approach. This approach is reasonable if it's a psik reisha denichale. If it's a psik reisha denichale and he derives benefit and pleasure from the result, then we could fairly assume he might not be aware of it, but probably benivchei machshavoisov, he also had kavanah to the result, because it is nichale. It is something he wants. It is something he benefits from. But if it's a psik reisha deloi nichale, there's no reason at all to assume that he had kavanah. So the other approach to understand the concept of psik reisha chayav would be, when it's a psik reisha, there is no need for kavanah. Why not? Two different drochim. So today we're dealing with dakus, with daken shebedaken. One approach would be, Chazal give a moshel, and the moshel is very significant and fundamental. A person is tearing off the head of a bird, severing the head. Would he say, I had no intention to kill this bird? Well, cutting off the head of a living creature equals killing. It's just different words. It's not two sides of the same kind. It's the coin. It's the same side of the same coin. This is just playing with words. Cutting off the head of a living creature equals killing that creature. And that is a davar hamischaven. It is not because we assume that you have direct intention to kill, but it is as if, because it is the same. It's impossible to cut off the head of a living creature without killing that animal, and therefore this is equals kavanah. A different interpretation would be going back to the reason that is mutar. So I quoted the Maral, the Yosef Engel, the Chazon Ish, and going all the way back to the Rosh. The Rosh Masechet Chulin Daf Lamed Aleph. What a person does without kavanah is not misiachas to the person. So what links a person to the actions and deeds he performs is intention. But maybe there is more than one formula that would link a person to his actions. And maybe the hechreach, the fact that the result is predestined. Maybe the hechreach is also miyachas that they saw to the oisa hamaisim. And that would be a different interpretation why psik reisha is chayiv. Not because we assume he has intention, Not because cutting off the head and killing an animal is one and the same, but rather, who says the only formula that links a person to his actions is kavanah? Maybe there's another formula as well, and that is echreach. When a person does A, and A necessarily, naturally causes B, then the fact that A must bring about B, that is enough to link the person to B and not only to A. And that is how we define psik reisha. If it's a psik reisha and the result is predestined, then the hechrech in itself ties that result to the person that did A, because A equals B. And that is why Komas Chaven LaA is as if he is Mechaven to B. So these are different formulas to understand why psik reisha is chayiv. Is it because we assume psik reisha is it Dover HaMeschaven? Or is it because psik reisha equals Dover HaMeschaven? Either because two sides of the same coin are just the same, or is the hechreach ties a person to the result of his actions, just like kavanah would tie a person and link him to the result of his actions. My understanding of the shita oruch kederech harashoino. The oruch maintains that the reason psik reisha is chayiv is because we assume he did have kavanah. He might not be aware of the fact that he has kavanah, but he did have kavanah. And that is totally unreasonable unless it is a psik reisha denichale. V'kama hadvorim smeichim umeirim. It is actually mefurish in the Rosh. Shabbos Daf Kuf Chav in the Suga Gram Kibui Perek Tezai in Siman Ches and Rosh. And I am quoting the Rosh when the Rosh brings the Oruch. Psik reisha Eloheiche de Nichalei Ba'odan Sahadi B'kumechaven the Ikala Meimar Anan Sahadi B'kumechaven. Because the person is aware that the result is predestined and it is a result that he wants. It is a result the Nichalei. If it's a psik reisha the Nichalei Anan Sahadi B'kumechaven. So in my Sefer in Shabbos Pei Daled, they also emphasize the Lashon of the Rambam, even though I don't think it's a hechreach in the Lashon of the Rambam. So the Rambam, Perek Aleph, Halacha Vov, when the Rambam writes the concept of psik reisha, and I quote the Lashon of the Rambam, Osa Masa V'Nasas B'Glorim Alocha Shevadei Teyosa B'Shvelo Yisay Ma'isa Nasas B'Glorim Alocha Shevadei Teyosa B'Shvelo Yisay Ma'isa Aval B'Shelo Nischav L'Chayev Shadova Yadua, Sheyefshe Shaloi Teyosa Oisa HaMalocha. So what does the Rambam mean when he adds on Shadova Yadua, Sheyefshe Shaloi Teyosa Oisa HaMalocha? So when I wrote Minchas Osha and Shabbos, and that goes back many, many, many years, my understanding in the Rambam was Shadova Yadua, Sheyefshe Shaloi Teyosa HaMalocha. To whom is it Yedua? To the person that does the malacha, and therefore we assume it is his kavanah. But I don't think so. When I go over the Lashon Rambam again, I am more familiar today with the Lashonos of the Rambam than I was many years ago when I was a younger man. I think I wrote the Sefer on Shabbos Tavshin Mem Ches or Tavshin Mem Tes. That's many years ago. I think Rambam writes that Dovi Yadua Sheyefshe Shaloi Teyosa Oisa Malocha. It doesn't mean that the person is aware. It means that we are aware. It is predestined. We know that it must happen. So I don't think this is necessarily Pshat in the Rambam, but I do think it's Mefurish in Rosh. לפרש האורך דרב שמעון לא מחי ורב פסיקריישא דניחא ליה, איקרא מימר ענן סהדי דכל מחד. And all the other Rishonim that are choilek on the Aruch, and they maintain psikreisha is a psikreisha with a nichalei or a nichalei. Their interpretation of psikreisha is not anan sahada de nichalei, no. But rather, the second mahalach I explained in psikreisha. When the result is predestined and there's no other way to do A without doing B, then A and B become the same. Cutting off a head equals killing. It equals natilas neshama. So one cannot say, I didn't want to kill, I just wanted to cut off the head. Because cutting off the head and killing is one and the same. Or the other knach I suggested, if A must bring about B, then there is no need for intention to link the result to the person. Dai behechoreach yaches tetzah le'adam she'oise es hamais. And if that is no difference between psikreisha denichalei and psikreisha deloi nichalei, every psikreisha should be chayev. And the only reason to be maker of a psikreisha denichalei, it is because it is the malacha she'ein zicha leguf. So Rashi, Tzvachim Tzadik Aleph maintains, when the Gemara asks, Mezalfen mayim al gabe hu ishim, you're allowed to sprinkle water on the Mizbeach, and the Gemara says, well, there is a lav. You're not allowed to be mechabe eish amarocha. And the Gemara says, Dov Hashem escham, and the Gemara says, psikreisha. And the Gemara says, he's mezalef, he sprinkles very little droplets. Rashi says, because yochal zalav betipas dakois, even though it's not little droplets, it's not defined as a psikreisha. So Rashi's understanding is, even though the way he performs the malacha lamaisa b'foil, it is a psikreisha. But if he could achieve, he could do the same maisa without having it be a psikreisha, it is not defined as a psikreisha. But Rashi is a yochid b'rishonim with that chiddush. Other Rishonim maintain it would always depend. If it's a psikreisha, it's a psikreisha. And this is another pluk that I will explain based on the different interpretations. If we say A and B are the same, it is only if A and B are always the same. Whenever you cut off the head of a living creature, you're bringing about the immediate death, demise of that creature. And that is why psikreisha is chayev. But sprinkling water on Galei HaMizbeach is not always bringing forth kibui. And therefore, we cannot say that ziluf mayim and kibui are the same. They're not intrinsically the same, because there's a possibility to be mezalaf mayim al gabe mizbeach without causing kibui. That is Rashi's understanding. So in my svor, in both in Psochim, Simachov, Tessin, Simalamed, and Shabbos, and Pei Daled, I try to explain different shittas and different pluktas and different shilas in the sugya of psikreisha based on the various different interpretations of pshotim that I suggested be a soida din of psikreisha. For instance, very well-known machlokes between the Turazov and Rabbi Kiva, Turazov and Archaim and Shabbos and Kiva and Hilchos Basa B'Cholov, Kachi Darka Shel Torah. What is the din of a suffix psikreisha? But unlike Dov Shem Eschaven, in which the suffix is a suffix la'osid, we're dealing with the suffix lisha'avar. Person is closing a drawer, and there might be flies in that drawer. It's closing a door. There might be an animal in the room. He's not aware. Does that suffix render the Maisa Dov Hashem Eschaven? Or is that a psikration? You don't know whether there's a deer in the house. But if there's a deer in the house, then it's a Sveika Diuraisa. The Turazov and Shinta Zayim maintains, as long as there's a suffix, it's not a psikration. So Dov Hashem Eschaven and it's mutar. Rabbi Kivegas and Pei Zayin and Bosa Bacholov disagrees. And Rabbi Kivegas says, well, if you don't know whether it's a psikration or not, it's a Sveika Diuraisa. But it is a psikration. The difference between psikration and Dov Hashem Eschaven, according to Rabbi Kivega, is Gorer Odam Kisei Mite Vesavsa. You're dragging a bench in the sand. You're grabbing a bench on earth. You don't know. You might be making an impression. You might not be making an impression. Depends how hard the earth is. That is a Dov Hashem Eschaven because the result is unknown. But when your suffix is l'sha'avar, according to the B'kiveger, it's Sveika Diurais. The Taz says, still a Dov Hashem Eschaven. So once again, if we say Psikreisha is chayiv because anan sehadi dekumachaven, I think the Taz is right. If the result is unknown to the person, then we can't say anan sehadi dekumachaven. But if our understanding of Psikreisha is A equals B, and A and B are the same, then I think Rebbe Kivega would be more reasonable. So when you learn the sugyas of Dov Hashem Eschaven and Psikreisha, I think the asaidas I discussed today are essential. They're very, very important. Number one, what's the head of Dov Hashem Eschaven? So I am amazed that I haven't seen this Yesod explicitly in any of the great Achronim. Yes, I quoted the Rebbe Yosef Engel, I quoted the Maral, I quoted the Chazon Ish, but those are just sparks, sparks that are gone in an instant. I haven't seen any of the great Gedolim to ask this fundamental question and make a sugya out of it. So this is my basic approach in many sugyas in Shas. When we wonder, why doesn't any one of the great Rishonim explain something? The only reasonable answer would be, it must be something extremely asidistic, extremely fundamental, so fundamental, and so asidistic that the Rishonim, with their infinite wisdom and insight and profound amkus, didn't occur to them that they need to explain such simple things. And that is my approach regarding the machlekes, this is Sichas Kavana machlekes Amaroim, and the machlekes of Yerub Shimon regarding Dov Hashem Eschaven. So Dov Hashem Eschaven is not defined as Maseh HaAdam, because what is unique about Maseh HaAdam and what sets him apart from all the other creatures in the world, it's Surei Kedem, Shebora HaKodesh Baruch Hu B'Maaseh Bereishis, is his mind and his intention. And therefore, Dov Hashem Shaloi B'Chavona, Einoi Maseh HaAdam, as I quoted. And this brings us to 2 or maybe 3 different pshotim. Why is Psikreisha different? The understanding of the Orach is Psikreisha Anan Sahavi Denichalei, Anan Sahavi Dekumachaven, and that is only Psikreisha Denichalei. The Kloisenberger was a giant, unique in many ways. He was truly a giant that walked amongst us in Torah, in Avodah, in caring for Klal Yisrael. So I want to speak primarily about what I saw with my eyes and what I experienced. We moved to Kiryat Sanz in Netanya 3 days before my bar mitzvah. And all my Bochel Shion I learned by the Klois Magerevi. And of the many Gedolim I came to know throughout the years, and I had a close relationship with almost all the Gedolim during my lifetime, starting with Rav Moshe and Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. I had a especially close kesher with Rabbi Yaakov, but I knew Rav Moshe. And Gedolei Eretz Yisrael, Reb Shimon Zalman. I had a very close relationship with Rav Yosef. Many times he turned to me and he asked me to write shuvas, and he relied on my psukim. I had a very, very close and unique relationship with Yeres Shachar, with Rav Alex Steinman, as Rabbi Gottesman knows very well. I accompanied him on some of his trips abroad, to Toronto, to Chicago, to New York, to Los Angeles. I knew most of the Gedolim during my lifetime, but my Rebbe Muvat was the Dveri Yatzif. So I want to share with you what I saw, what I experienced, but one can't tell the story of the place in the Gedolim without starting in the Holocaust, because it is then and there that he rose to the heights of Malachi Eshelis. Many times I told the story, my father first met the Klois Magerevi. It was the second day Shavuos Tafshin Dalet 1944. My father arrived in Auschwitz the first day Shavuos, and that very same day he lost his Zayda, his Baba, his father, his mother, and 5 of his siblings, who went up in smoke in the chimneys of Auschwitz. One day later, the Klois Magerevi arrived, and he lost most of his family. And my father approached the Klois Magerevi, and he expressed his chus to try to become close to the Rebbe and help him out as much as he can. Those 13 or 14 months in Auschwitz, from Auschwitz to Warsaw, from Warsaw to Dachau, from Dachau to Tutsi, till the liberation. The Klois Magerevi, throughout this ordeal, kept his kedusha, and he didn't eat cooked food. So all they had to eat is a piece of awful bread and some awful drink that they called coffee in the morning, and then a horrific soup with meat. When they came back from work, and that was Bosan Avelis Atrefis. And the Klois Magerevi used to swap his soup for a piece of bread or a raw piece of potato. He passed into everyone, eat whatever you have or whatever you could eat, because it's pikuach nefesh. But for himself, he was machmir. When he worked, and he worked just like all the others, because to the Nazis, there was no difference between the greatest gadol and the simpleton. To them, we were all vermin, less than vermin. Yemach shemam v'zichron. And when the Klois Magerevi used to work, avodas perach, sfosoisav merach eshois, and somebody bent down and put his ear very close to the Rebbe's mouth, and he realized that he's quoting the posuk Tachas asher lo yovadetu es Hashem elokecho b'simcha v'b'tuv leiv. And that posuk was shogar al Shonoi all the time. Tachas asher lo yovadetu es Hashem elokecho b'simcha v'b'tuv leiv. Many years later, in a private conversation I once had with a Rebbe, he said, not for one moment was I maharer achrei midosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when I heard those words, I shuddered. I just couldn't believe that a human being going through this Gehenna, leaving his wife, losing his wife and 11 children, his entire family, all he had, his wife and 11 children. For one moment, didn't I question HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when the Mishnah says that Masechet Tovos Perek Hayasur Nisyonis Nisnas Avrom Avinu V'Omed B'Kulam, Rashi writes, "V'lo hirher achrei midosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu." That's the madrega of Avrom Avinu, and that was the madrega of the Kloisenberg. The moment of liberation, everybody tried to get back to life, and even many Gedolim. The initial response was just to care for themselves, try to get away, try to escape, try to run away from this nightmare. Not the Kloisenberg Rebbe. From the first moment, he dedicated every fiber of his soul and being to rebuild Klal Yisrael. So the Rebbe turned to my father and he said, "I want you to help me build." My father was a young boy. He was 19 at the time, and he said, "I want to learn." My father was a tremendous Ilui. And my father told the Rebbe, "I need to learn. I want to go back to yeshiva. I want to go back to the Gemara." And the Rebbe angrily told him, "You know nothing about Mesilas Nefesh. When one deprives himself from food, from drinks, from sleep," the Rebbe said, "That's Mesilas Aguf. It's not Mesilas Nefesh. Verklappen the Gemara for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's Mesilas Nefesh. Closing the Gemara for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is Mesilas Nefesh." Close the Gemara, my father did. And together with his great Rebbe, they built. In Fellenwald and Feldafing, establishing schools, chadorim, for boys, for girls, yeshivas, lekarav levi yisrael elavim shel hashamayim. The Rebbe was the shadchan in Fellenwald. He was the shadchan of my father and mother, and he was their Masada Kiddushin in Fellenwald. My oldest brother was born in Germany, in Fellenwald. And the Rebbe built. To close the Gemara for HaKadosh Baruch Hu's sake, that is the greatest Mesilas Nefesh. The Kloisenberg Rebbe was the greatest Ilui I knew. And my father was a tremendous Ilui. But that was a time to save and to salvage and to build. Many, many years ago, I don't recall when it was, I was invited by the Aguda to a convention to speak about the Kloisenberg Rebbe. Maybe it was even the first Yortzeit. It's 26 years since the Rebbe passed away, Tavshin Nun Daled. I think it was the first convention after the Rebbe passed away. And I was invited to speak Motzei Shabbos, speak about my Rebbe and to share some stories and thoughts. I told a story that happened the first Erev Yom Kippur, after the liberation. So Atzadik HaKadosh is sitting in his room preparing for Yom Kippur, and there's a knock on the door. The Rebbe opens the door, and there's a young girl standing there and crying, and she says, "I remember every year Erev Yom Kippur, my father used to bench me, but my father is no longer. So I came to ask the Rebbe to bench me." The Rebbe took a handkerchief, spread it on the little girl's head, put her hands on her head, and benched her. She left his room with a smile on her face. A few minutes later, there's another knock on the door, and another, and another. 85 girls stood in line, and the Rebbe patiently spread that handkerchief on the head of each and every one of them and benched them like a father mentions his children. I never knew a person that had 85 daughters, but Klozim the Rebbe had many more than 85 sons and daughters. He was the father to hundreds and to thousands that he brought Tachas Kanfei Ashkinu with love, with compassion, with caring. And he took care of all their needs. So that's briefly the story of the Klozim Rebbe in the Holocaust and its aftermath. But I want to share with you about the godless of the Klozim Rebbe. First of all, is godless b'Torah. I don't think ever since the Divrei Chaim, the Hasidic Rebbe, achieved the renown and the fame as a Gadol b'Torah like the Klozim Rebbe did. Many Hasidic masters were great Gedolim. Starting off the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, Meir Nesivim, Menoira HaTahira. Those were Gedolei Yisrael Talmidim of the great Maggid of Mezrich. The Chidush Harim was an unbelievable Charaf and one of the greatest Gedolim of his time. The Avnei Nezer. But I don't think any Hasidic Rebbe achieved the status of a Poisek Hador like the Divrei Chaim in his day and age. The Divrei Chaim, together with the Shoel HaMeishen and Reb Shlomo Kluger, were Poiskei Hador, and every major halachic controversy of that era find its way into the Tshuvas Divrei Chaim, like the Shoel HaMeishen and Reb Shlomo Kluger. And his great-grandson, the Divrei Yatzev, was the same. He was known as one of the greatest Gedolei Yisrael of our time. And the crown of his Torah activities was the Shalosh Tshuvas Divrei Yatzev. He was a Gevaldige Mefalbel. Never in the history of Chassidus was there a Rebbe that said a pilpul at the Tish Friday night, not even the Divrei Chaim. That is a minig unique to the Klozim Rebbe, and I think it's symbolic. So I remember the days going back more than 50 years. There weren't thousands of Hasidim by the Tish, not even hundreds. Sometimes there were 20 or 30 people there. That's all they were. 2 o'clock in the morning, the Rebbe says a pilpul that takes an hour. It's embarrassing to say, but almost everybody slept. My father was one of the only people that never slept. He was really into it. And the Klozim Rebbe insisted on saying that shtetl every Friday night. I think he wanted to convey a message that the Klozim Rebbe Torah, capitalist. Chassidus is Torah, Avodah is Torah, Yiras Shamayim is Torah, Avos Hashem is Torah. Torah reigns supreme. But he saw as most important the Tshuvas that he wrote, 7 volumes of Divrei Yatzev. And in his short introduction to Shalosh Tshuvas Divrei Yatzev, the Rebbe tells the story when he was a young boy sitting in his father's lap. His father was the Rudnik HaRav, a grandson of the Divrei Chaim. He was an awesome tzaddik. And his father told him, "You're going to be big. You're going to write a sefer. I want you to call the sefer Divrei Yatzev." Yatzev is Yekusiel Yehuda ben Tzvi, the name of the great Klozim Rebbe and his father. And then the Rebbe says when he visited the Ostrovtz Rebbe, he held himself a Talmud of the Ostrovtz. The Ostrovtz was an unbelievable goin and tzaddik. The Ostrovtz Rebbe told him, like a prophecy, "You're going to be big, you're going to write Tshuvas La'alacha, but To'eles Klal Yisrael." What is unique about the Tshuvas Divrei Yatzev is every Tshuva starts with a Gemara. And that is so important, such an important lesson. Because many Moedos today start off with Sifik Etzurim, many Tshuvas start off with the Mishnah Berurah. Every tshuva in Dveri starts with a Gemara. That's where it all comes from. That's where it all originates. Everything starts with the Gemara. That's an important lesson he tried to teach. And his Dvekis and Torah's Ahavas Torah was unbelievable. This is a story I told many times because I witnessed that story. I was there. So once a week, the Rebbe said a shir kloli for the entire yeshiva, but every day there was a private shir, only to a small group of bochaim. And for years I had the source to be one of that group. And I remember once the shir was exceptionally short. It was about 45 minutes. This year, it became obvious to everyone why this shir was so short. We were still sitting in the Rebbe's room when a person walked in. And I knew that person very well. It was a big nugget, a big tamchen diurais. He was very close to the Rebbe. So as it became obvious, a few days earlier, the Rebbe asked him, I want you to come to see me Tuesday, 8 o'clock. I have something very important to talk to you about. And the person objected and he said, it's impossible because I need to catch a flight 12 o'clock. And by the Rebbe, everybody knew that 8 could be 9, it could be 9:30. Zmanim were not very consistent by the Rebbe. So we apologized. And the Rebbe said, no, I promise, 8 o'clock, I'll be waiting for you. Person arrives at 8 o'clock, turns to the Gabbai. I have an appointment with the Rebbe, could you let me in? And the Gabbai says, well, he's in the middle of a shir. So he asks, when did he start the shir? He says, 7:45. 7:45? How long does the shir take? He says, an hour and a half, so probably by 9:30, 9:15, I'll be finished. And the person was shocked. Did the Rebbe forget that I need to catch a flight and he promised to be waiting for me at 8 o'clock? So the shir was exceptionally short. At about 8:25, the shir was over. And the person walks in and the Rebbe apologizes and he says, I did not forget. I didn't forget. We have an appointment at 8, but this afternoon I had an awful headache. It was unbearable. I took medicine, it didn't help. Rebbe always expressed himself in exaggerated terms. That was his sprach. I thought I'm going to die. I had no option, no other choice but to call the Bochamin in to learn with them. And we saw that on a daily basis. When he learned Torah, he got koiches loy ma'alam al-hudain, koiches l'malam derech hateva. He forgot about all his pain and all his suffering. They all just evaporated. Ka'ari, his nasai, and the moment he finished the shir, he just fell apart. That was the Kloisenberg Rebbe and his Dvekis and Torah, and his love of B'nai Torah. Like the Gemara says about Yechezkiyahu HaMelech. Let me share with you another story. So there was a person living in Kiryat. He worked in the girls' school. He wasn't a chassid. And 2 of his sons-in-law came for Shabbos, and they came to visit the Kloisenberg Rebbe. 2 Litvishin Galait that learned in Brisk, and the Rebbe talked with them and learning, and he was very inspired. He was very inspired, and he asked them, what's their parnasa? And they said, well, we get from the koilel, and everybody knows in Brisk we don't give much money. And the Rebbe was inspired. And then by Chumash Rashi was the Rebbe's platform where he spoke about the Yonah the Yoima and Divrei Musa. And I'll never forget that shmuz Chumash Rashi. The Rebbe said, 2 young Galait came to visit me. Brisk young Galait. Talmidei Chachomim Meflogim. And they are Mekayim Divrei Chazal, Pas b'melech Toichal, Mayim b'Mesurat Tishta. I don't need your Shtreimlach, he said. I don't need your Shtreimlach. You could throw away your Shtreimlach. What I need is Mesiras Nefesh for Torah. Believe me, he needed the Shtreimlach very much. He was makbid on minig avos kekutzoi shel Yud. And Chassidus Shalavish meant a great deal to him. But Torah meant 1,000 times more. and Yigiyas meant 1,000,000 times more than a Stein. Doesn't Shira. And I say, and his tefillah was unique. Our generation saw nothing like it. He davened like the Dveri, like Rebbe Kiva. Brochas Lamed Aleph, the Gemara says about Rebbe Kiva, Manicha Yodem B'Zavezu V'Matzah B'Zaves Acheres. His tefillahs were unlike any other. He davened for hours every day. Every Shmoneh Esrei was b'demois sholish. In the middle of Shmoneh Esrei, he spoke to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Yiddish. Tate crying, he used to say 10 times. Keben ha-meschata b'fnei Yavev. Mamish keben ha-meschata b'fnei Yavev. You could never figure out how long that tefillah will take. Alavai, I should daven once in my lifetime, the Leil Kol Nidrei, the way he davened every Vochadik Mincha, every Marev, always with priyas. There's a story told that when he was a young Rav in Klosenberg in Hungary, and in Hungary, it was the custom whenever a Rav visited town, first he came to visit the local Rav, the Morad HaAser. So it was told that the Minchas Alazah, the Munkach Rav, once came to visit Klosenberg, and he sent his Gabbai to check with the Klosenberg Rav whether he could come visit, and the Gabbai comes back and he says he's in the middle of Shabbos. So the Munkach Rav tells him, go check where he is in middle of Shabbos, you tell me. So he went back and he comes back to the Munkach Rav and he says, he's by Vayavorach David. And the Minchas Alazah asks him, go check. Is it Vayavorach or David? That's a joke, but yes, Vayavorach is not the same as David. That's the way he davened. Sometimes the Shachas could take 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And you could never guess where he's going to cry and where he's going to stop. His tefillahs were Keben ha-meschata b'fnei Yavev. And when I come to think of it, this Goen v'Kodesh, Tzadik Yesod Olam, whose entire life was Torah and Avodah. And he built a hospital. And he established Kiryot. He built the Yishuv in Netanya and a Yishuv in Yerushalayim. And these endeavors are time-consuming. Today we have Ma'ane HaYeshua and B'nai Barak. But at the time, it was unknown. Nobody understood. A Rebbe building a hospital, a Hasidic Rebbe, it's not a shtibel. Because his devotion to Klal Yisrael was unlimited. His entire life was Mesiras Nefesh. For him, to close the Gemara was really Mesiras Nefesh. Shashua Shel Torah was what kept him going. That was his koyach, that was his sustenance, that was his life. Torah and avodah, Torah and tefillah. But if Klal Yisrael needs a hospital, he will build a hospital. His devotion to Tzarchei HaKlal knew no limit. Medrash Tanchuma, Rav Asi Lifnei Moshe was bitterly crying, and his Talmidim asked him, why are you crying? You weren't even Isaac B'Tzarchet Siver. You were such a great master. And Rav Asi says, that is why I'm crying. Because I wasn't Isaac B'Tzarchet Siver. I wasn't Noisa Ba'ol Im Chaveirai. So the Klosenberg Rebbe needed not to cry. He was not only a giant in Torah, a giant in Avodah. He was Noisa Ba'ol B'Chaveira V'Oisi B'Tzarchet Siver. And that is part of his unbelievable greatness. He should be a Melech Yosha for Klal Yisrael, and we should all try to emulate his ways. Tzilach be'ikvei hatzorim. We should try to follow in his footsteps in Torah, in Avodah, in Tzarchit Tzivu. Should be a Melech Yosef Klal Yisrael. We should only know Besoros Tovis Yeshua's V'Nachomes. We should be Zocher B'Korav T'Tchias HaMesim and be as Goel Tzedek and Binyan Beis HaMikdash B'Peiro B'Yomeinu.
Amen. Yeshkach, Kvayed HaRav, and he's Zichrei Baruch. There'll be a Chazar Shir in today's Shir, and we will meet tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock for our Chana Shir for the week. The Sugis of Sikresha. Thank you.
Go to all of you.
Thank you very much.